In 1979, the statistical probability of your child being snatched by a stranger on a New York City street was roughly the same as finding a living dinosaur in Central Park, or perhaps just a fraction higher. On May 25th of that year, 7-year-old Etan Patz was granted a small, fatal piece of independence. He was allowed to walk 2 blocks to the school bus stop alone for the very first time. In his pocket, he carried a single dollar bill, a small fortune for a first grader, destined for a soda and a mountain of penny candy. Etan never made it to the store, and that unspent dollar became the most expensive investment in American paranoia. To understand this story, you have to forget the SoHo of today. Forget the high-end lofts, the boutiques, and the $15 lattes. In 1979, SoHo was a wasteland of industrial skeletons and struggling artists. It was a place of cast-iron facades, vast, empty spaces, and a heavy silence that fell as soon as the sun went down. It was a neighborhood where community was a necessity, not a buzzword. Parents looked out for one another, and doors were often left unlocked because, honestly, what was there to steal? This was the era of latchkey kids, a generation that wore their house keys on strings around their necks like amulets of freedom. But on that May morning, the freedom of a whole generation was quietly strangled in a basement on Prince Street. The morning of May 25th was ordinary, which is the most terrifying part of any tragedy. The sun was pale, the air was crisp, and the city was just beginning to hum with its usual chaotic energy. Etan's mother, Julie, watched him walk away from their loft at 6:48 a.m., marking the exact moment a normal life ended and a 40-year nightmare began. He was wearing a black captain's hat and a blue parka, clutching that dollar like a ticket to adulthood. He felt like a grown-up, finally trusted with the simplest of urban rituals. When the school bus returned that afternoon and Etan wasn't on it, the silence in the Patz household became deafening. By the time the sun set, the neighborhood was flooded with posters, flashlights, and a growing sense of dread that would eventually paralyze the entire nation. The police didn't arrive with sirens blaring. They arrived with questions that felt like accusations, and a bureaucracy that moved with the speed of cooling lava. Back then, law enforcement operated on a principle of procedural lethargy. If a child went missing, the standard response was to wait 72 hours. The police department's bureaucracy was a labyrinth of carbon paper, rotary phones, and filing cabinets where reports went to die. The assumption was simple. He's playing video games at a friend's house, or he's ran off to his grandmother's. There was no Amber Alert. There was no centralized database. There was no protocol for an abducted child, because, in the eyes of the law, children didn't get abducted by strangers. They just got lost. The NYPD was looking for a lost boy in a city of 8 million people using tools that were essentially prehistoric. They treated the disappearance of a child with the same administrative indifference as a stolen bicycle or a skipped subway fare. Etan Patz became patient zero for the virus we now call stranger danger. Before him, America was a place where the neighbor was just a friendly guy with a lawnmower. After him, every man in a beige trench coat was a potential Hannibal Lecter. It was a cultural pivot point, the moment we transitioned from the naive openness of the 70s to the gated community mindset of the modern era. It's the sociological equivalent of moving from the early 90s internet, where everyone was a friend, to the modern web, where every link is a potential phishing scam. The media didn't just cover the story, they consumed it, turning a family's private grief into a national obsession that sold newspapers and fueled primetime ratings. The investigation itself was a masterclass in frustration, systemic failure, and the desperation of a city that had lost its way. For decades, the police chased ghosts and shadows. They dug up basements in SoHo, breaking through concrete while the media watched like vultures, hoping for a glimpse of bone or fabric. They tracked leads to Israel based on nothing but whispers and the wild imaginations of psychics. They focused their lens for years on a convicted child molester named Jose Ramos. Ramos had a connection to the family's babysitter, and for years he was the perfect villain, a monster we could point at and blame to feel better about ourselves. He was already in prison for other crimes, which made it convenient for the narrative. We wanted Ramos to be the killer because it fit the archetype of a predator, but the legal system is a slow, grinding machine. And without a body or a confession, the case remained a gaping wound in the heart of New York. Every time a new tip came in, the Patz family had to exhume their grief all over again, living in a perpetual state of what if. Let's talk about the profitability of this disappearance. Etan's death spawned a massive, multi-billion-dollar industry of fear. Etan was the first face ever printed on a milk carton, an innovation that turned the breakfast table into a crime scene. It was a brilliant, albeit macabre, marketing campaign. You'd sit down for breakfast, pouring milk over your cereal, and a void would stare back at you. It was a daily ritual of terror delivered to every kitchen table in America. This wasn't just about finding one boy. It was about selling a climate of fear. If it could happen in safe SoHo to a good family, it could happen anywhere. The milk carton didn't find many children, but it successfully raised a generation of parents who viewed the world as a predator's playground. Then came the security boom. Sales of deadbolts, home surveillance systems, and panic buttons surged by 300% over the next decade. We didn't just buy locks. We bought a temporary reprieve from our own imaginations. The architecture of our homes changed. Fences grew higher, windows became barred, and the open-door policy of the American suburb died a quiet death. Parenting transformed from a background task into a high-stakes, 24/7 tactical operation. The helicopter parent was born in the shadow of Etan's disappearance. We traded the freedom of our children for the illusion of their safety, creating a generation of kids who were never allowed to be alone, never allowed to explore. We built invisible cages and called it protection, oblivious to the fact that we were suffocating the very independence we claimed to value. In 1979, Etan's dollar could buy 2 gallons of gas or a dozen packs of baseball cards. Today, we spend millions on specialized task forces, biometric scanners, and GPS tracking for toddlers. But on that day, the system was bankrupt. It offered nothing but sympathy and a shrug. The breakthrough didn't come from a high-tech lab or a profiling genius. It didn't come from the FBI's most elite units or satellite surveillance. It came in 2012, when a man named Pedro Hernandez was turned in by his own family members who couldn't live with the rot of the secret any longer. It was a mundane ending to an extraordinary tragedy. Hernandez wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't a flamboyant villain from a Hollywood thriller or a shadowy figure from a conspiracy theory. He was a low-level stock clerk in a neighborhood bodega on the very corner where Etan was last seen. This is what philosophers call the banality of evil. Hernandez had lured the boy into the basement with the promise of a soda, using the boy's own dollar against him, strangled him, and put his body in a box with the trash. He went home, he ate dinner, he lived his life. There were no elaborate torture chambers, no complex kidnapping plots. It was a momentary impulse, a dopamine hit of power over the vulnerable, followed by decades of silence. For 33 years, Hernandez lived a quiet, unremarkable life in New Jersey. He had a family. He went to church. He was that guy you'd see at the grocery store or the gas station. This proves that the most dangerous people aren't the ones hiding in the bushes with masks, but the ones handing you your change and smiling at your kids. It was a classic case of negative selection of attention. We stare at the freaks on the news while we're being robbed by the guy in the next apartment. The trial was a grueling revisit of a dead era, a post-mortem of a city that had failed its most vulnerable citizen. It exposed the flaws of the original investigation, how the bodega was never properly searched, how the obvious suspects were ignored in favor of more exciting leads, and how the police missed the killer because he was too ordinary to be noticed. Hernandez was eventually convicted in 2017, but the closure felt hollow and bitter. The body was never found. It was lost in the vast, shifting landfills of Staten Island decades ago, buried under the literal trash of the city. The dollar remained unspent, and the innocence of a city was unrecoverable. The Patz family never moved. They kept the same loft on Prince Street, kept the same phone number, waiting for a son who was never coming back. They refused to change their lives because changing meant accepting that he was gone. Their endurance was a form of silent, agonizing protest against a world that had moved on to the next headline. So, what is the tally 45 years later? May 25th is now National Missing Children's Day, a date etched into the calendar by Ronald Reagan himself to remind us of our failures. But the irony is sharp. Modern cities are statistically safer than they have ever been, yet our fear is exponentially larger and more profitable. We have created an industry of amnesia where hard facts are replaced by collective hysteria. We live in a world of total surveillance, where every square inch of SoHo is covered by high-definition cameras and facial recognition software. Yet we feel less secure than the people who left their doors unlocked in 1979. We have exchanged privacy for a false sense of security, and we have exchanged community for a network of digital sensors. The milk carton era ended, replaced by Amber Alerts that scream from our smartphones, vibrating with the same urgency as a nuclear strike warning. But the psychological scars remain. We have raised 2 generations of children who view the outside world as a minefield and every stranger as a threat. We have criminalized the very independence that Etan was trying to exercise that morning. We have turned childhood into a series of supervised playdates and tracked movements. Etan Patz didn't just vanish. He took the latchkey kid era with him, and he took the idea of the city as a shared space. He left us with a world of Ring doorbells, biometric tracking, and a permanent sense of dread that vibrates in our pockets every time our kids don't answer a text within 30 seconds. The SoHo lofts are now worth millions, occupied by the global elite who think they are safe behind their triple-locked doors and private security details. They walk the same streets Etan walked, but they see them through the lens of threat assessment. The price of walking 2 blocks alone has become too high for anyone to pay. The ghost of a 7-year-old boy in a black captain's hat still haunts those cobblestones, a reminder that in the market of human life, trust was the first thing we liquidated, and we've been paying the interest on that debt ever since. This is the negative rent of the modern city. We pay more to feel less, and the void on the milk carton has simply migrated to the glowing screens in our palms. We are more connected than ever, yet more isolated by our fear, forever searching for a safety that died on a Friday morning in May 45 years ago. The tragedy of Etan Patz isn't just that he was lost, but that in trying to find him, we lost ourselves.